Bibles in your care, come along and join with me in the 32nd chapter that's recorded by the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 32. I want to commence with verse 6 and conclude with verse 7. If you're reading from the King James rendering, ye shall find the following words printed. Do ye thus requite the Lord, O foolish people and unwise? Is not he thy father that hath brought thee? Hath he not made thee and established thee? Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee. Thy elders, and they will tell thee. You may be seated in the presence of God, highlighting the 8th clause of verse 7 again for the sake of our argument. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. I simply want to talk about briefly from this thought, remembering how we got over. Remembering how we got over. And if the army of Christ here, there, or gathered, I would that you would repeat our thought after us, if you would, please. Remembering how we got over. Now give the Lord a hand praise for what he's about to do. My brothers and sisters, in the late 70s, a song was sung by an old pioneer, a man of the faith by the name of Mahalia Jackson. She sung a song entitled How I Got Over, and then she later on added to the song, I Done Got Over. I remember coming up in East Mount Olive Baptist Church as a little boy. Every New Year's Eve watch night service, they would take a bell at 12:01 and ring the bell. Those old sisters would get up and start singing the song, Tone the Bell. I done got over. I done got over at last. And so, brothers and sisters, it becomes incumbent upon you and I that every now and then you and I ought to go back and reflect about how we came to even be here. We're here simply by the grace of God. We're not here because we've been so good and we've been so kind, but we are here by the grace of God. When you look at the attention of our text, before you can understand and appreciate why Moses tells them to remember, you got to go back a couple of chapters. If you look at Deuteronomy chapters 29 and chapter 30, Moses gives his final sermon. as they are about to enter into the promised land. And in Moses' sermon, he proclaims three very important things to Israel, as to them always to remember how they got over. And that they ought not ever forget where they came from. Those three things that he addressed in his sermon was, number one, he reminded them of the covenant. The covenant that God had made with Israel, and urges Israel, listen, obey God's laws so that you will not experience the curses of that law. The second thing he brings across to them is, he says, now remember the change. Moses tells Israel, he said, listen, that the Lord, listen, gonna change your hearts while you are yet in captivity. And now that captivity does not always mean being enslaved. Of course, you know, Israel was always hard-headed. And throughout the Old Testament, we see Israel win a victory, and then they get hard-headed, become stiff-necked, and they end up becoming captive by their foes. And he said, listen, even while you are in there, he said, listen, the Lord gonna show you love, and the Lord gonna eventually deliver you wholeheartedly. Matter of fact, what he's going to do is that he's going to regather you again together and restore you and bless you and make you prosperous than ever before. So don't ever forget that God can still change. And then the third thing he says in his sermon, he said, listen, remember the choice. He says, Moses tells them in his sermon, today the Lord has given you the choice between life and death. He's given you the choice between blessings and curses. Moses says, I have given you the choice, and I've called upon heaven and earth to witness the choice that you made. And oh, that you choose to remember and reflect how you got over and where the Lord has brought you out of the flesh pots of Egypt and crossed you over the Red Sea. Don't ever forget where the Lord has brought you from. But then after he points out those three points, he moves on, chapter 31 and 32, and we see Moses now, after he has given them the sermon, now he gives his parting instructions, and he prepares to pass on the responsibilities of leadership to Joshua. And there's several things that he points out. The very first thing he says, Joshua, remember who God is. And by remembering who God is and by loving him, then you're saying that you're going to continue to set apart yourself. And so before all the people, Moses commissions Joshua as their new leader, commanded Joshua to be courageous, for he would lead these people into the land that the Lord swore to give to their ancestors. Then he comes back and he reminds them, and he says, listen, don't ever forget the scriptures. Then Moses finishes writing the law, and he instructs the Israelites to read it every 7th year. And that was the time of the festival of shelter. That's why those of you who are in the political field, in the political ring, know that 7 stands for completion. But usually within the 7th year, if there were ever going to be any changes, that would be the time that they would call for what is called an amendment. Not a change, just to add to that. So he says, in the 7th year, always bring the law so that the people will always know the law. Right. And that it will stand as a witness against their sins. But then, while he's doing that, there became a crisis. Moses' heart begins to become wounded. And here's why. Because the Lord tells Moses, he says, Moses, listen, I want you to know this, that the same